In January of 1958 at a Nanjing conference, Chairman Mao Zedong announced his second five-year plan. His previous five-year plan had buoyed China's newly communist economy to new heights, having reportedly quadrupled steel production and nearly doubled coal production. From 1953 to 1957, the government had seized most private property, had established workers' communes complete with centralized kitchens, and had gained control of the means of production. This so-called command economy was doing remarkably well, and a second five-year plan seemed promising. This is the story of the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was meant to help China overtake the UK in all areas of industry within 15 years by engaging its larger population in a continuous communist revolution. Every citizen was a comrade, every comrade a soldier, and every soldier expected to toe the party line and quote-unquote battle hard for 3 years to change the face of China. Immediately, the government embarked upon a massive irrigation campaign, hoping that this would turbocharge grain production. Instead of relying on experts' advice, however, local officials relied upon the intuition of often illiterate farmers. It should come as no surprise that soon soil erosion caused landslides, reservoirs were choked with silt, and once flowing rivers became clogged with mud. Of particular interest is the Three-Gate Gorge Dam on the Yellow River. Chinese civilization is believed to have begun on the banks of the Yellow River, which at first runs clear but then picks up sediment from less plateaus. The saying, "when the Yellow River flows clear," is the Chinese equivalent of "when pigs fly." Controlling the Yellow River via a dam would have immeasurable propaganda value, but all it did was make the mud worse. Work on the Three-Gate Gorge Dam began in April of 1957 and was completed by 1959. 6 million square meters of earth had been moved, and multiple 150,000 kilowatt turbines had been installed by tens of thousands of villagers. Just a year later, though, sediment started accumulating and inching upstream, requiring extensive rebuilding that lowered the waterline and made the turbines useless. By the mid-1960s, foreigners were banned from the dam because the mud had become so damn bad, but workers cut corners to save time. This, viewers, would be a recurring theme throughout the Great Leap Forward. Workers, under ever-increasing pressure to fulfill ever-impossible quotas, would cut corners, resulting in ever-decreasing quality. Ultimately, hundreds of dams were built in the wrong location, with shoddy materials, with poor workmanship, or with poor design. The amount of earth became the single metric in determining how productive each province and county was, not the amount of usefulness that these projects actually provided. In the process, tens of millions were made to work with few tools and with little food or rest. Hundreds of thousands died, and the harvest was disrupted because 1 in 6 was busy building useless dams. Idea of how backbreaking this labor was. In May of 1958, Chairman Mao Zedong himself picked up a shovel at the Mingtomb Reservoir and was too tired to continue after a mere half hour. As fruitless as the dams were, though, they were always a sideshow. The main focus was on simultaneously improving agriculture and industry. To do the former, lots of fertilizer was needed. The villagers were caught up in such a fertilizer frenzy that they used everything from human and animal manure to hair to seaweed to even their own homes to make fertilizer. Huts made of mud or straw were torn down. It is thought that up to 40% of the nation's housing was destroyed in this period. In fact, in parts of Jiangsu province, white sugar was spread onto the fields. White sugar, pure glucose. Two other agricultural quote-unquote innovations were close planting and deep plowing. Chairman Mao thought that when plants grew together, they would be more comfortable. At any rate, in Guangdong province, farmers were ordered to plant more than 250 kilos of peanuts per hectare. And by harvest time, all they had was a disappointing 525 kilos per hectare. As for deep plowing, farmers had to plow the land to a depth of anywhere from 30 centimeters to 3 meters. 3 meters! 3 fucking meters! Some of you may be wondering what the experts thought about this. Unfortunately, there were no experts. In 1956, the government had a change of heart and invited criticism, declaring, "Let 100 flowers bloom, and 100 schools of thought contend." The criticism was so overwhelming, so passionate, and so indiscriminate that Mao launched an anti-rightist movement in 1957, leading to the arrest, torture, exile, dismissal, or execution of 300,000 individuals, give or take. After the January 1959 Lushan Conference, a second wave targeted over 250,000 intellectuals. The Ministry of Justice was even dissolved in that same year. Here's a quick side note. This is something Mao actually said at the Lushan Conference. "You said that at the North China meeting, I fucked your mother for 40 days, and here at Lushan, you only fucked my mother for 20 days, so I still owe you 20 days. Now we indulge your desire, and I even added 5 days on top of the 40 we have had so far, that you can insult us as much as you want. Otherwise, we would owe you." Well, moving on. Besides having an aggressive domestic policy, Mao also had an aggressive foreign policy. Dumping is a practice where a government or corporation sells goods for less than the price of production, not to generate profit, but to gain prominence in a market and starve out competitors. Typically, after a period of dumping, a government or corporation will then raise prices to turn a profit and take advantage of the lack of competition. This was a tactic often used by American monopolies like Standard Oil, and it would have worked wonders for China if it were not for 3 reasons. Number 1, most of the Western world had imposed sanctions on China after the Korean War and its 1958 shelling of 2 Taiwanese-controlled islands, Quemoy and Matsu. Number 2, China could not keep up with the demand generated by its low prices. In 1958, for instance, it had trouble making good on a poultry commitment of 2,000 tons of poultry for East Germany. Number 3, because Chinese workers had to cut corners to keep up with the aforementioned demand, Chinese products gained a lousy reputation. 1/5 of all coal sent to Switzerland was just stones. A third of pork tins were rusty, and a third of the pumpkin seeds sold to Morocco had insects. In 1959, China spent about 250 million yuan to replace substandard merchandise, to say nothing of the losses involved in selling violins for $5 each and frozen quail for 8 cents each. China also aggressively handed out foreign aid to other socialist countries. $84 million to Burma and 11.2 million to Cambodia, as well as 142 million rubles to Vietnam and 112.5 million rubles to Albania. Honoring foreign commitments became the number 1 priority of the nation, considered more important than feeding the people. When they weren't handing out foreign aid like lobbyists hand out business cards, they were being overly ambitious in paying off debts. For instance, the Russians told the Chinese in 1961 that they could delay paying off any of their outstanding debts until the next year, and even then they would only have to fork over 8 million rubles. While we don't know how much they paid in 1961, we do know that the Chinese paid 138 million rubles in 1962 and 97 million in the year after that one. To this day, many still erroneously believe that the USSR forced China to hand over all of the money at once. Now, it's time I talk about industry. In 1957, Chairman Mao wanted to surpass the UK's industrial capabilities within 15 years, particularly in steel production. At the time, China produced 5,340,000 tons of the alloy, less than one fourth what the UK made. Nevertheless, he felt confident because his first 5 year plan had allegedly quadrupled steel production. Hint, hint, false facts. And because his communist neighbor to the north had launched Sputniks 1 and 2 and had surpassed the US in steel production, Mao turned to backyard furnaces as the solution. Ordinary citizens with very little to no training were told to gather up pots, pans, doorknobs, and other iron objects and tasked with creating steel in their own backyards. Even children had to man the furnaces as part of a work-study program. Add to this the fact that local militias forced people at gunpoint to work for days on end, and that local bosses, called cadres, cut rations to lower costs. And you can see why this was such a dangerous environment. One has to wonder here why the people didn't protest this harsh treatment. The answer is that if they did, they could be arrested, beaten, paraded through the streets naked, be sent to re-education camps, denounced as anti-revolutionary rightists, or even be executed. Any problems were usually interpreted as a wrong implementation of Chairman Mao's ideas, and anything that couldn't be dismissed that way were thought to be outweighed by all the supposed good. Then, the chap who made the report would suffer one of the cheerful punishments described above. Remember, the Great Leap Forward very quickly became a military endeavor, and that meant any and all disobedience, or even hints of disobedience, had to be stamped out. Of all the people who died in this half-decade-long famine, just under 10% were beaten to death. Half of all cadres practiced corporal punishment, and the other half that didn't could themselves be beaten by their superiors. Cadres could also starve their subjects because they controlled the main food source, the communal kitchens and cafeterias. The central government gave out red, gray, and white flags to model provinces, mediocre ones, and laggards, respectively. And likewise, cadres kept a list of their subjects and assigned them red, gray, or white flags based on their performance, measured in work points. Those who didn't work hard enough were banned from the commune, given less food, or given a watery concoction with little nutrition. They were stuck in a literal death spiral. Not having the energy to work hard enough meant receiving less food, which meant not having the energy to work hard enough, which meant receiving less food. Few considerations were made for genuine illness or injury. And if anyone thought about cooking food at home, there were militias roaming around, punishing people for doing just that. Ultimately, up to 45 million people died during the course of the Great Leap Forward, shelved in 1962. Influenced by falsified reports about the size of the harvest, the central government eventually took a full third of produce, leaving farmers with next to nothing. Soon, farmers began hiding grain, and local militias got used to tearing down walls to uncover said grain. Cannibalism and suicide were rampant. Hundreds of thousands left the country, and millions left the countryside for the cities, which had subsidized healthcare and more jobs. The economy from 1960 to 1962 alone contracted by 45% to just a mere 35 billion yuan. Half the population had famine edema, a condition where starvation strips away so much protein from the body that blood vessels leak loads of fluid. Euphemisms like so-and-so had the water beaten out of him became common. In some areas, up to 20% of women suffered from a prolapsed uterus caused by lack of protein in the diet and overwork. In severe cases, a woman's uterus could literally flop out of her vagina and hang between her legs. Many children were abandoned on the side of the road because their parents could not care for them, and the sick, wicked justification that they produced was that because everything belonged to the state, the government was supposed to take care of kids. But did Mao ever learn his lesson? No. 4 years later, he would launch a 10-year cultural revolution, which only strengthened his cult of personality and the myriad problems it wrought upon China. But that's a story for another time. You, dear viewers, can learn from his losses. When something goes wrong, more of that something will only make it worse. If you pour a tiny bit of water onto a grease fire and it explodes in your face, more water will make it worse. And if someone warns you not to throw water onto a grease fire, you should resist whatever temptation you may have to throw him into the grease fire, because that too will make it worse. And if you, God forbid, develop a pattern of throwing good Samaritans into grease fires, do not be surprised when people stop warning you about how playing with fire is dangerous. I kid you not, so many of China's problems could have been chalked up to these 3 reasons. This is Lessons from Losses, and this is The Great Leap Forward. Stay tuned for more, and be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video.